Hey guys, this is Group 7, and we're going to be looking into the WorldCom fraud, which was a huge accounting fraud involving one of the largest telecommunications in the US. It was largely perpetrated by their CEO Bernard Ebbers, who was later indicted for securities fraud. But as you guys know, most frauds involve employee collusion. And the fact that this was an accounting fraud, he had to enlist the help of several others, including their former CFO, Scott Sullivan, who also got a 5-year indictment as a result. But before we start digging too deep into the scam itself, since this is a fraud class, we're going to have to get a sense of the aspects of the fraud triangle, as well as inclination and the characteristics of the person. So let's go way back to the very beginning and find out, who was Bernard Ebbers really? Ebbers was born to a family of devout Christians in Alberta, Canada, with 4 brothers and sisters, but his family would move around often, and he would find them soon moving to the Navajo Mission Post in California, before they moved back to Canada when he was in his late teens. He was eventually able to graduate from the Mississippi College with a bachelor's degree in physical education after having dropped out of 2 universities previously. Now it was time for him to pursue employment. Unfortunately for him, he didn't have the best luck at finding jobs at first and had to do odd jobs like a security guard or even as a milkman. And later he found a job as a basketball coach. But then eventually he would be lucky enough to have a friend who would loan him the money so that he could buy a motel, which he was eventually able to turn into a series of 9 Best Westerns. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find exact data statistics for these motels to detail the exact revenues and profits, but according to the CNBC report, he operated it like a spendthrift and was able to create great savings by doing a lot of the work himself. That's when he was introduced to this guy, a man named Murray Waldron. Murray was an investor, and he was looking for a group of investors to start a long-distance telephone company. It was at this point in time that monopolies like AT&T and Bell were just being broken up, and this gave him the bright idea to get a group of investors together and open his own long-distance firm. He did just that, and the next year, they would open LDDS, which would later be renamed WorldCom in 1995. Bernard Ebbers was made a partner, but he would later be named the CEO of the company. They did well over these first few years, and as you can see in these charts, the stock price this entire time was increasing year over year. Bernie Ebbers had 2 main focuses. The first was the same factor that he had always considered in the motel days, being cost control. He ran WorldCom like a spendthrift as well, and he was such a cheapskate that an employee in an interview actually said that he had replaced the lunchroom coffee machine with a vending machine. Their next focus became corporate acquisitions, and they began to merge with nearly every company in the competition. Many say it was these very acquisitions which were behind its quick rise and fall.
In business news, several federal agencies are going to work reviewing WorldCom's proposed buyout of MCI. This would be the biggest corporate merger in U.S. business history.
This is just a list to name a few of the companies they merged with, as some sources say there were around 60 of them. But as you can see, some of the companies they merged with had very high market caps, even higher than WorldCom's. Newspapers started calling Bernard the telecom cowboy, and it seemed like their growth through acquisition technique was working well. By 1999, Bernard Ebbers was making $935 a year, plus $27 million in stock options. Bernard liked to flaunt this success, and he wasn't as cost efficient in his personal life, buying houses, cars, a golf course, a ranch. He spent a lot of money during these first few years, but this wouldn't last because the industry would soon take a hit. The telecom industry would crash in the year 2000, and this would send their stock tumbling all the way down to the $12 range. But despite this, Bernard Ebbers still remained a cheerleader for WorldCom.
Is WorldCom a financially sound, solid, surviving company?
Absolutely. We are free cash flow positive. We announced that today.
Now this is where he started to experience problems. Now if you remember a little while ago, he had just bought a house, a car, a golf course. Well, all of those purchases he had made using loans from JP Morgan and Citibank, using the stock of WorldCom as collateral. But now that the stock price had crashed down to $12, those banks were knocking at his door asking for their money back. This put Bernard in a really tough position because now he owed the banks $408 million. Now he was in a position of conflict between the board and the bank. The bank just wanted their money back, but the board didn't want him to sell all the stocks because that was a move that would have drove down investor confidence and further drove down the price. Ultimately, the board eventually decided that they would just loan him the $408 million. But this was a bad move because this brought around the SEC, who started asking questions. You see, the suspicious thing was that during these bad times for telecom, when other companies like AT&T were doing very bad, WorldCom claimed that they were doing fine and nothing was wrong over there. The board sits down and then they decide that Ebbers is too much of a liability. So on April 29, 2002, they tell him to turn in his resignation. But unfortunately for them, this may already have been too late. Many people started speaking out, the number of whistleblowers increased, and it seems employees weren't content with how the corporate culture was forcing them to make unethical decisions. But what was so unethical, you ask? Well, hold on, let me explain a little bit. They started by reducing their reported line costs by $3.3 billion in the years 1999 and 2000, doing this so often that they exhausted the ability to do this, so they switched to capitalizing line costs. They also exaggerated their reported revenues. The corporate culture was so strict that it demanded that they meet these targets. Sullivan even expressed concern on the growing number of fake entries, saying, and I quote, "We are going to dig ourselves into a huge hole." But it seems as if Ebbers was unconcerned. Eventually, though, the investigation would come to light due to the fact that there was just so many whistleblowers, combined with the SEC investigation that was happening, and Ebbers would then be arrested.
Everybody, there is big trouble this morning for the nation's second biggest long-distance provider. WorldCom said last night that an internal investigation has uncovered massive accounting fraud, almost $4 billion in disguised expenses, in what could become one of the biggest accounting scandals in U.S. history.
News of their arrest swept the nation, and it was soon found out that the controller, David Myers, as well as the CFO, Scott Sullivan, were also arrested. Sullivan would later turn a cooperating witness and received a reduced sentence of 5 years as a result. It had unfortunately got to the point where even internal auditors were getting suspicious. This is an interview with Cynthia Cooper where she details her experience. She explains what situations had initially manifested her suspicions. For example, the statement where she says that the CFO, Scott Sullivan, had asked her to delay the capital expenditure audits. And soon after that, Myers sent her an email asking her the same thing. This is what made her suspicions begin to grow. But they ultimately culminated with her going door to door. When she arrived to Myers' door, he confessed, and it seems as if he was no longer able to rationalize his actions. She goes further to say how Scott had equal say as Bernie and was a major factor in all decisions. She also speaks about the culture and how Bernie had created a culture of risk. But to further speak about that, let's take a deeper dive into the fraud triangle, namely the pressure element. Now the question really is, what could have pressured all of these different people into committing these unethical acts? Well, our textbook defines them as non-shareable pressures. And these can differ from financial pressures, prestige, personal pressures such as family and culture, but obviously the pressure that each individual felt was different. There can be many different factors which may contribute to this pressure, but in this instance it seems to have largely been the corporate culture. A thorough investigation was done after the facts, and this is the report of the investigation done by the Special Investigative Committee of the Board of Directors of WorldCom. It details the entire fraud, including its origin. And if we click on WorldCom's culture, it details how WorldCom had a culture of bullying, and how that bullying started all the way at the top. Ebbers created the pressure that led to the fraud. He demanded the results he had promised and appeared to scorn the procedures and people that should have done a check on misreporting. So as you can see, he had little respect for rules. And furthermore, he would constantly push the pressure that was on him onto his employees. He would use manipulative behavior
on occasional being emotional and insulting, constantly with reference to the personal financial harm he faced if the stock price declined, which is indicative of his manipulative behavior towards his employees. Furthermore, when financial personnel did raise questions about accounting discrepancies, management would just send them intimidating and belittling emails to quiet them down. So as you can see, there was a systemic attitude of pressure. A large part of it was due to the corporate culture and the tone at the top. But as you're aware, it takes more than just pressure to execute a fraud. So let's analyze this case from the rationalization perspective of the fraud triangle. Rationalization differs for individuals as they are motivated by different things, but it is becoming more and more obvious that a lot of the individuals involved were motivated by pressure, a large part of that being from Ebbers. We can see in this Cynthia Cooper interview that she states that Myers had decided he would tell Cynthia if she confronted him, which is what he told his wife at the time. So you can see he was having a difficult time rationalizing his acts. Sullivan, on the other hand, had to face greater repercussions as the fraud was implemented by and under his direction. While we saw previously that he was concerned that they may have been digging themselves into a hole, he maintained the cover-up and continued rationalizing his actions all the way until they eventually got caught, at which point he cooperated with investigators in favor of a reduced sentence. Now, I wasn't able to find too much information on Sullivan's character to determine how he may have rationalized these acts, but I was able to find this interview of Myers in which he speaks about Bernie's nature, how he interacted with the board, and gives some context to why he was so influential. But I'll let you guys watch it for yourself.
Bernie, when things were good, was your best friend. One of the things that I believe that employees will say about Bernie is that in the cafeteria, he knew most everybody's name in Jackson. He made a point on Friday afternoons of walking through the building, calling people by name, asking them how they were doing. So from an employee's perspective, he literally was a god on earth. Bernie Ebbers' relationship with the board of directors at WorldCom was a good old boys club. The people that were typically on the board were people that he either had brought up from the very beginning, the initial investors in the company, or they were either board members or executives of companies that had been acquired. And so each of those individuals, each of the board members actually had a large percentage of their net worth tied into the performance of the company. The board, I don't believe, ever exercised any independence. Literally, the people that were there were Bernie's friends. And I don't believe that in any situation the board ever decided to do something opposite of what Bernie had suggested.
So as you can see, Bernard was a manipulative individual who created a situation where everyone was loyal to him and wouldn't bite the hand that feeds them. Which leads me to my next topic of how he could have rationalized his own act. Now, if you'll recall from the textbook, they described the theory of inclination, wherein if an individual exhibits a number of these factors, they may be more inclined to commit a fraud. After reading that investigative report, we can see that Bernie displayed a number of these. He was nobodying in the way that he treated people, extremely calculating, obviously lying, navigated the system as best he could, and seemed to have a sense of entitlement. Having all of these traits doesn't necessarily mean an individual will commit fraud, but an entitled person who knows how to navigate the system will have an easier time rationalizing his actions to get what he wants. So now we have an inclined individual with a taste for the finer things, we have pressures of greed as well as prestige, and we arrive at the last piece necessary in the fraud triangle, which is the opportunity. Opportunities to commit fraud can be tempting for some, even more so if one is in the position to exploit that opportunity. In order to properly analyze the opportunity, though, we must first determine its origin. A quick Google search will tell us that opportunity can arise from three factors, namely weak internal controls, poor tone at the top, and inadequate accounting policies. Now, if you'll recall from the report of the investigation, we've already established the presence of all three of these factors. This scam wasn't the result of some sort of technological prowess, nor did it involve WorldCom's technology or engineering in any way. Simply put, it was the result of a few senior executives implementing unethical misconduct in its financial and accounting departments. The only reason they carried on as long as it did was because of a lack of courage to blow the whistle on behalf of their respective departments, along with inadequate audits by Arthur Andersen. It was a consequence of the way Bernard ran his company, and a direct result of the pressure he himself created. Since he was in a position of power, it's not as if there was a time that these opportunities weren't present for him, so it seems as if the decisions he made were largely a result of the pressure he faced when his personal empire was about to crumble. This would be supported by the fact that the largest part of the fraud occurred after the stock price crashed, in a vain attempt to assuage his own dire financial situation. They capitalized line costs to the point where they couldn't anymore, so they began exaggerating reported revenues. Consolidated financial information was only available at senior levels, which kept the ongoings concealed within a smaller circle. If you will recall from the Cynthia Cooper interview, Myers was having a difficult time rationalizing these false entries. Sullivan himself was an intelligent individual who was awarded a CFO Excellence Award in 1998. These don't seem to be the type of individuals who would willingly partake in a fraud. For that reason, I would say that this fraud was less the result of an opportunity and more the product of a narcissistic, calculating individual with his back to the wall and nowhere to turn. Unfortunately for him, the decisions he made during this time period would prove to be quite costly, and he would ultimately pay the price by receiving a 25-year sentence. Ebbers would never see freedom again, until 1 month before his death, when he was granted an early release on compassionate terms. He would soon die a month later, but the mark he left behind would not be forgotten. Due to the myriad of accounting scandals that taking place in the early 2000s, Congress would pass the Sarbanes-Oxley Act on July 30th of 2002, which mandated strict reforms and imposed new penalties on rule breakers in an attempt to curb financial scandals such as Enron and WorldCom, as well as restore investor confidence. That concludes our presentation. Thank you guys for watching, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the discussion below. Thanks.